Ink dries in seconds. A signature takes less than a breath. But what is written beneath what is signed, in the white space between the lines, can hollow out an empire before the pen is ever lifted. In the sealed quiet of the obsidian room, where fortunes changed hands over plates of food nobody touched, a trap was closing one clause at a time. Patricia felt it before she could name it. Something in the room's careful architecture was wrong. Not in the way a picture hangs crooked, but in the way a foundation settles before the wall cracks. She moved through the table settings with the fluid efficiency of someone who had learned to take up no space, a figure in pressed black, calibrated to exist at the edge of attention. She was not here. She was the hand that refilled the crystal glass, the shadow that straightened the silverware and withdrew. She had spent 3 years becoming exactly this, a woman so thoroughly erased that even she had stopped looking for herself. In her hands, lifting a water pitcher with the unhurried precision of long practice, gave nothing away. They did not shake. They had never shaken. That had always been the particular cruelty of her composure, that the steadiest part of her was the surface, while everything beneath it had been rubble for years. 3 years since the case. 3 years since the clause she found became the weapon they used against her. She had chosen this quiet like someone choosing a room with no windows. Not because it was comfortable, but because nothing inside it could reach her. Tonight, though, something was different. Her eyes had found the contract, and the contract had found her back. Before we step back into the Obsidian Room, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Hidden Mafia Chronicles, and comment on where you're watching from. It takes a specific kind of discipline to unlearn your own mind. Now, for 3 years, Patricia had practiced the art of becoming furniture. The black server's vest and crisp white shirt were not a uniform. They were camouflage. They signaled to the wealthy patrons of the city's most exclusive dining rooms that the woman pouring their Cabernet did not have the capacity to comprehend the multi-million-dollar acquisitions being discussed over the appetizers. Before the uniform, she had been the architect who tested their foundations. At Sterling & Vance, Patricia hadn't just practiced international commercial law. She performed autopsies on it. When a massive corporate merger began to rot from the inside, she was the one they called to unravel the corpse, clause by sub-paragraph, until she found the hidden joint where the poison had been injected. She was the sharpest structural legal mind in her field, the kind of lawyer who could find the crooked hinge in a 50-page agreement before the ink was even brought to the table. Until she found a poison so deep, the architects decided it was easier to bury her than rewrite the contract. The disbarment had been swift, surgical, and absolute. Nexus Pacific hadn't just taken her career. They had fabricated a digital trail of document tampering so perfectly executed, it left her professionally obliterated and buried under crushing legal fees. In her cramped, windowless apartment, a thick stack of final notice debt letters sat shoved inside a kitchen drawer, not demanding payments in silence. She met those demands by carrying trays of seared Wagyu to men who wore the same tailored suits as the executives who ruined her. She wasn't bitter. Bitterness required a surplus of emotional energy she no longer possessed. She was simply numb, moving through a grayscale existence designed purely for survival. The hardest part wasn't the grueling hours or the invisibility. It was the restraint. It was the sheer, suffocating effort it took to walk past an open contract resting on a mahogany table and force her eyes to blur the text. She had spent 36 months surviving by looking away. Tonight was supposed to be no different. Just another private dining suite, just another closed-door signing ceremony in the Obsidian Room. She just needed to keep her head down, pour the water, and get through the shift. The Obsidian Room was not designed for dining. It was designed for coronation. Just beyond the heavy mahogany doors stood men whose bespoke tailoring could not quite hide the rigid, unnatural lines of shoulder holsters. Patricia moved along the periphery, her tray of crystal water pitchers balanced with practiced indifference, feeling the sheer weight of the air. The space smelled of beeswax and the quiet friction of expensive worsted wool. 4 men sat around the vast expanse of polished mahogany, their suits bespoke, their movements careful and deliberate. And this was the theater of the untouchable, a closed-door ceremony where empires were traded, At the head of the table sat Myung-ho Moon. He did not speak, yet the room's entire geometry seemed bent toward his chair. Whenever he shifted his weight, the conversation of the Western investors paused, snagged by the invisible gravity he commanded. He possessed the profound stillness of a man who had spent decades turning ruthlessness into legitimate enterprise. He didn't demand attention. He simply absorbed it, letting the room wait on his next breath. Standing just behind Moon's right shoulder, anchoring him to the room, was Daniel Seo. If Moon was the stone, Seo was the current that made the water navigable. He was immaculate, radiating a genuine disarming warmth that softened the jagged edges of the high-stakes summit. As he leaned down to murmur a clarification, his hand rested lightly on the back of Moon's chair, a gesture of profound, earned trust. The consortium has agreed to the revised timeline, sir," Seo murmured, his voice a smooth baritone of absolute loyalty. "It's exactly as we structured it. We're ready." Seo's smile to the investors was easy and bright. He had the relaxed, steady gaze of a man with nothing to hide, whose conscience was entirely clean. Patricia watched him smooth the pages flat, recognizing the fluid, comforting rhythm of an advisor who had shepherded 1,000 deals to safety. Between them lay the leather-bound folder, 47 pages of dense, immaculate architecture that would fuse Moon's Korean asset network with the consortium's capital. The room settled into a breathless, anticipatory hush. There were no debates left to be had. All that remained was the finality of ink. Moon unbuttoned his suit jacket with a single, measured motion and accepted the gold-nibbed fountain pen Seo respectfully offered. The inevitability of the moment crystallized. The pen was already in Moon's hand. Patricia stepped into the narrow space between the Western investors and Moon, tilting the heavy crystal pitcher over a half-empty water glass. As the water poured silently, her gaze slipped. It fell onto the illuminated white space of page 47, resting open and vulnerable in the center of the mahogany table. She didn't mean to read it, but her brain, wired by a decade of forensic legal analysis, began to process the architecture of the text before she could force herself to look away. Recognition built in disjointed fragments. She noticed the unusual sub-numbering convention first, a nested tier of Roman numerals buried beneath standard alphabetical clauses. Then, the sheer density of the surrounding language registered. It was a block of impenetrable, exhausting text, strategically positioned at the bottom third of the page. Now an established, visual fatigue point designed specifically to make a tired reader skim past it. Then her eyes found the operative sentence hiding deep inside Clause 17, subparagraph 4. Recognition hit her with the violence of a physical blow. A cold, precise sensation bloomed directly behind her sternum, stealing the air from her lungs. It was the visceral, dizzying shock of seeing a monster you thought was dead, sitting quietly in a locked room. She was looking at the exact same mechanism that had destroyed her life 3 years ago, perfectly replicated in a context that made absolute zero sense. She knew the anatomy of this trap intimately. It was not a mistake, and it was not a negotiation tactic. It was a predator. The provision was brilliantly engineered to masquerade as standard regulatory protection, a supposed shield for Moon's assets. But beneath that camouflage lay a silent transfer mechanism. It was a trapdoor waiting to be triggered by a manufactured dispute months down the line. Once sprung, it wouldn't attack the empire from the outside. It would quietly hollow it out from within, instantly transferring operational control to the very men smiling across the table. It was a weapon designed to look like a handshake. Moon's gold-nibbed pen began its slow, inevitable descent toward the signature line. The air in the obsidian room suddenly felt dangerously thin. The polished wood, on the bespoke suits, the flickering candlelight, the entire room tilted violently on its axis. Patricia closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. When she opened them, her hand, still holding the crystal pitcher, steadied. The words on the page ceased to be ink and became a trigger, irrevocable. The heavy oak door of the disciplinary committee room clicking shut, sealing her inside with the architects of her ruin. Fiduciary transfer. The terrified, when averting eyes of a 23-year-old paralegal, bought and paid for by Nexus Pacific, stammering out a fabricated timeline under oath. in perpetuity, the physical, leaden weight of the State Bar's final disbarment letter resting cold in her palms. The memories did not surface as a narrative. They hit her as shrapnel, tearing through the carefully constructed numbness she had maintained for 3 years. And every piece of what Nexus Pacific had done to her landed in the space between one breath and the next. The surgical precision of the frame-up, the sheer, terrifying ease with which they had rewritten reality. Time dilated, compressing the obsidian room into a breathless vacuum. Patricia stood at the precipice of a brutal, split-second calculus. If she simply finished pouring the water and stepped back into the shadows, she kept her miserable, invisible life. She kept the uniform, the studio apartment, the safety of being a ghost. If she spoke, she was stepping back into the crosshairs of a predator that had already killed her once. Worse, she was dealing with the immediate physical proximity of Myung-Ho Moon. This was a man whose enterprise extended into dark, violent territories she could not fully map. The men standing guard outside this door did not file legal injunctions. They made problems permanently disappear. To interrupt him, to touch him, was to invite a violence far more immediate than a courtroom. She had stood at this exact intersection of fear and morality once before. 3 years ago, she had calculated the odds, filed the proper internal complaints, and played by the rules of survival. She had chosen the rational answer. She had chosen to wait for the system to protect her. It was the wrong answer. She knew exactly what that calculation cost. Complicity disguised as pragmatism was just a slower way to die. The gold nib of Moon's fountain pen hovered a single millimeter above the textured parchment. The ink was pooling at the tip, heavy and dark, a fraction of a second away from bleeding into the fibers and quietly signing away an empire. Her mind was still running the risk assessment, desperately screaming at her to retreat into the quiet where it was safe. But her hand moved before the argument was finished. The distance between Patricia and Moon's right hand was less than 2 feet. She closed it with the deliberate, unhurried grace of someone stepping onto a ledge. She did not lunge. A sudden movement would summon the men stationed outside the heavy mahogany doors. It would shatter the room's fragile equilibrium before she could speak. Instead, she shifted her angle of approach. She stepped deeply into the narrow pocket of space between Moon and the lead investor, deliberately turning her shoulder to eclipse the consortium's line of sight. To the men across the table, it looked like a server leaning in to adjust a setting. To Myung-Ho Moon, it was a sudden, total eclipse. Her hand left the crystal pitcher. It moved through the candlelight, casting a long, sharp shadow across page 47. Then, her fingers closed around his wrist. The contact was shocking in its audacity, but there was no violence in her grip. There was no trembling, no frantic pleading, no performed desperation. It was a clamp of absolute, terrifying certainty. It was the physical weight of a woman arresting a fatal collision. The gold nib of the pen halted a millimeter above the paper. Patricia leaned down, her face inches from his, and spoke. Her voice was stripped of the deferential, invisible cadence of a server. It was the flat, clinical resonance of a brilliant attorney identifying a corpse. "Nah, don't sign that contract." They were the quietest words spoken in the obsidian room all night. Then came the 1-second window, the span of a single heartbeat where the entire reality of the room hung suspended. Moon did not gasp. He did not shout for security. The stillness that made him a kingpin deepened into something glacial. He slowly raised his eyes from the paper to the hand gripping his wrist, and then, shifting his gaze just a fraction up to Patricia's face. The intelligence behind his eyes was instantly, violently awake, processing the precise geometry of the interruption. And in that microscopic fracture of time, the room betrayed its architect. Standing just behind Moon, Daniel Seo reacted. It wasn't a shout or a panicked step backward. It was a visceral reflex. His hand, which had been resting lightly on the back of Moon's tailored shoulder, contracted. His fingers tightened into the expensive wool, an involuntary and desperate clench of a man who suddenly realizes the trap has been spotted. Patricia saw the fabric pull. Moon felt the pressure against his collarbone. A heavy, suffocating silence slammed into the space, drowning out the ambient hum of the city below. Patricia and Moon locked eyes in the white-hot center of that silence, communicating an entire ledger of betrayal without blinking. Moon understood in a fraction of a second that the danger wasn't the woman holding his arm, but it was the man guarding his back. The pen remained suspended. Myung-ho Moon did not pull away. Moon's gaze broke from hers. He did not wrench his arm away. With deliberate, terrifying calm, he simply withdrew his wrist from her fingers, pulling the gold fountain pen back from the precipice. He did not summon the guards, standing just beyond the threshold. He did not hand the 47 pages to an assistant to review, nor did he ask the woman standing beside him to explain her audacity. Now he simply pulled the leather-bound folder toward the center of his chest. He was a man who had built an empire in the shadows, and he had always understood a fundamental truth. The most lethal document in any room is the one everyone insists is a mere formality. The obsidian room descended into a crushing vacuum of sound. Moon bypassed the executive summaries and the bolded headers, turning the heavy parchment pages with slow, steady friction until he reached the dense block of text on the bottom third of page 47. He found clause 17. He read the nested Roman numerals. He read the operative sentence buried deep within subparagraph 4. He read the precise predatory architecture of his own ruin, laid out in perfectly justified margins. He read it only once. Not a single muscle in his jaw tightened. His expression remained an impenetrable mask of polished stone. When he finished, he gently folded the leather cover shut. He capped the fountain pen and set it down on the mahogany table. The soft click of the metal casing was barely louder than a drawn breath, yet it struck the silence like a dropped anvil. "Gentlemen," Moon said, his voice a flat, unreadable expanse. "This signing is postponed." The lead investor blinked, leaning forward to protest, but Moon raised a single hand, instantly silencing the far side of the table. "Pending an independent review by my private legal team." As he spoke the words, Moon did not look at the consortium. He turned his head slowly, raising his eyes to look at Daniel Seo. He watched his trusted advisor the way a demolition expert watches a concrete pillar, waiting for the microscopic dust that betrays a fatal structural crack. Seo's polished, disarming warmth had evaporated, leaving behind a rigid, bloodless pallor. The advisor's rehearsed smile was gone. "Daniel," Moon said, the softness in his tone infinitely more dangerous than a shout. "Wait for me in the adjoining suite." Seo swallowed. He gave one sharp, mechanical nod and allowed two of Moon's silent associates to escort him through the frosted glass doors. He did not come back out. The consortium was quietly and firmly ushered to the private elevators. The multi-million-dollar joint venture dissolved into the chilled air. The trap was permanently closed. Poe was standing on the other side of the heavy wooden service doors, her back pressed flat against the wallpaper of the corridor. Patricia closed her eyes. She let her shoulders drop, leaning into the wall, and for the first time in 3 long, suffocating years, she finally exhaled. The heavy oak doors of the obsidian room clicked shut, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. The investors were gone. Daniel Seo was gone. Only the half-empty crystal glasses and the leather-bound folder remained. Patricia stepped back through the service entrance, her hands empty. Myung-ho Moon had not moved from the head of the mahogany table. He looked up as she entered, his dark eyes registering the black vest, the white shirt, the careful, practiced posture. He did not ask her to pour more water. He simply raised a hand and gestured to the empty, high-backed leather chair directly across from him, the seat just vacated by the lead investor. Patricia crossed the thick carpet and sat down. Moon studied her. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant murmur that commanded the cavernous room. He did not ask about Clause 17. He did not ask about the trap he had almost stepped into. "Who taught you to read a contract like that?" She did not hesitate. Sitting across from a man who commanded an underworld empire, she felt a strange, cold equilibrium. The worst thing that could happen to her had already occurred 3 years ago. She told him everything. She did not perform her trauma or let her voice tremble. She delivered the history of her ruin with the flat, clinical precision of a lead attorney giving a deposition. It was the only tone she trusted herself to use. the only way to keep the suffocating 3-year-old grief from fracturing her composure. She told him about her tenure as a corporate acquisitions attorney at Sterling and Vance. She explained the Nexus Pacific deal, the moment she found the hidden join in their agreement, and the internal complaint she had filed. She detailed the surgical efficiency of her own destruction, the fabricated digital trail placed on her work laptop, the young paralegal bribed to deliver false testimony, the swift disbarment that stripped her of her identity and buried her in debt before she ever reached a hearing. "It is a silent transfer provision," Patricia explained, her eyes locked on the leather folder resting between them, buried under 3 layers of boilerplate legalese. In the event of a regulatory dispute, which their legal division can manufacture at will, full operational control of your Korean asset network would automatically transfer to the consortium. They wouldn't take your empire today. They would take it in 6 months, and the law would say you handed it to them. Moon did not interrupt. He barely blinked. "I didn't guess," she finished quietly, her hands folded completely still in her lap. "I recognize the authorial fingerprint. I know what it was designed to do to you, because it is the reason I am wearing this uniform." The obsidian room grew heavy with the weight of her testimony. The silence stretched between them, deep and absolute, as Moon processed the sheer scale of the architecture she had just exposed. Then, Moon leaned back in his chair. "You were not the first." Those 5 words did not let her sleep. Patricia sat in the dark of her cramped apartment, watching the faint neon wash from the street bleed through the thin walls. "You were not the first." The sentence echoed through the quiet, dismantling the narrative she had forced herself to accept. For 3 years, she had believed her ruin was a localized infection, a singular punishment for looking too closely at one specific Nexus Pacific deal. But if she wasn't the first, she wasn't a mistake. She was collateral damage in an established supply chain. By the time she stood in Moon's glass-walled corporate headquarters the next morning, the server's uniform was gone, replaced by a simple pressed blazer she had kept wrapped in plastic at the back of her closet. Moon sat at the head of a brushed steel conference table, flanked by 2 men whose tailored suits did not quite hide their tactical bearing. Spread across the surface were 4 thick dossiers, the collapsed remains of 4 different corporate empires. One of the men, a lead investigator, slid the first file toward her and opened his mouth to begin the briefing. Patricia didn't let him. Her eyes had already locked onto the open pages. The heavy numbness that had shrouded her brain for 36 months evaporated, instantly replaced by the lethal, frictionless speed of a predatory intellect. She reached out, pulling the 2nd and 3rd files closer, arranging the contracts side by side. "Look at the subnumbering," Patricia said, her voice sharp and ringing in the quiet room. No, she didn't look at the investigators. She looked directly at Moon. Her index finger tapped a dense paragraph in the first file, then moved to identical positions in the others. Nested Roman numerals buried beneath standard alphabetical headers. It's a visual fatigue tactic designed specifically to hide the operative trigger. The investigator blinked, glancing at his boss, but Moon simply raised a single finger, ordering the man to stay silent and let her work. "It's the exact same ambiguity technique," Patricia continued, her eyes scanning the text faster than the men could track. "They use discretionary compliance triggers disguised as boilerplate. In this shipping merger, it was an environmental compliance clause. In the tech acquisition, it was a data sovereignty dispute. They draft the language so broadly that their own legal division can manufacture a violation out of thin air. And the penalty," she slid the final file toward the center of the table, "is an automatic fiduciary transfer. They aren't just breaking these companies. This is a replicable, scalable business model. The architect behind this isn't acquiring assets. He's engineering situations where his targets willingly sign the papers that dismantle themselves." She finally looked up, her breathing shallow but her hands perfectly steady. Moon watched her with dark, unreadable eyes, and the silence in the room was absolute. "Vincent Hale," Moon said softly, "Director of Strategic Acquisitions at Nexus Pacific." Patricia held his gaze. The crushing weight on her chest finally cracked. She wasn't being rescued from her debts or her miserable apartment. For the first time in 3 years, she was standing in a room with a man who had the power to burn an empire to the ground, and she was being believed. The heavy leather document case arrived during the dinner rush. I handed across the host stand by a man in a charcoal suit who did not ask for a signature and did not wait for an acknowledgement. It bore only a blank white label with her name. Patricia carried it into the narrow, fluorescent-lit staff break room, the hum of the industrial refrigerator the only sound as she set it on the scratched laminate table. She unclasped the brass locks. The lingering scent of seared wagyu and spilled Cabernet on her apron clashed violently with the sterile, an high-stakes reality resting inside the leather. Inside lay the forensic autopsy of her ruin. It was not a summary of Nexus Pacific's global operations. It was a meticulous, page-by-page dismantling of the specific 3-year-long lie that had been her life. Patricia sat in the plastic chair, her server's apron still tied around her waist, and began to read. She did not cry. The emotion that gripped her throat was too cold and too absolute for tears. It was the terrifying, breathless vertigo of having reality violently handed back to her. The first document was a sworn, notarized confession from the 23-year-old paralegal. Patricia read the young man's stammering apologies, transcribed in stark black ink, detailing exactly how he had been cornered, threatened, and ultimately bought. Attached to it was the banking ledger, an offshore wire transfer from a Nexus Pacific discretionary fund. It was an agonizingly mundane sum. Now, that was the exact price of her reputation. Beneath that lay the digital forensics, pages of server logs and keystroke data recovered by Moon's people, proving what Patricia had screamed into the void 3 years ago. The tampered files had never been altered on her laptop. They had been fabricated on a Nexus Pacific server and uploaded remotely to her machine in the middle of the night. The logs were irrefutable. Every fabricated timestamp, every manufactured piece of evidence that the state bar had used to publicly strip her of her license was laid bare as a calculated fiction. Her hands finally trembled as she turned the pages. For 3 years, a tiny, insidious part of her had almost started to believe the gaslighting, that maybe she had missed something, maybe she'd been reckless, maybe she deserved the quiet, invisible punishment of this uniform. Looking at the raw data, the suffocating weight of that guilt evaporated, like replaced by a hollow, ringing devastation for the time that had been stolen from her. She reached the bottom of the case. There was a single sheet of heavy stock paper resting beneath the evidence, bearing a brief, typewritten notation from Moon's lead investigator. It was a summary of the timeline, tracing the dates of her disbarment against Vincent Hale's promotion. Patricia read the final paragraph. The operation against her had not been a frantic reaction to her uncovering a bad deal, and she had not been collateral damage. According to the internal communications Moon's team had intercepted, her destruction had been engineered before she even opened the file. She was a test run. The revelation that she was a test run stripped the last of the air from the cramped break room. But as Patricia turned the final pages of the dossier, the personal devastation hardened into something structural, cold, and immensely clear. Her ruin had not been an act of desperate self-preservation by a corporation caught in a lie. It was merely research and development. Spread across the scratched laminate table was the full, terrifying scope of Vincent Hale's architecture. Nexus Pacific didn't just employ a ruthless legal department. They harbored a covert corporate sabotage division operating under the immaculate camouflage of international commercial law. The 4 other collapsed empires in Moon's files were not isolated tragedies or aggressive acquisitions. They were the mass production phase of Hale's design. The methodology was brilliantly perverse in its patience. Hale's team would identify a target, orchestrate a highly lucrative joint venture, and bury the silent transfer provision deep within the boilerplate. The target would sign, hands would be shaken, and for 6 months, there would be absolute silence. Now, by the time the manufactured regulatory dispute was triggered, the executives were already legally bound, their operational control quietly bleeding out through a wound they hadn't even felt open. It was a documented, replicable model for corporate predation, a ghost army that conquered boardrooms without ever raising its voice. And Hale had been perfecting it for a long time. Patricia stared at the timeline of the 4 collapsed deals, her eyes tracing backward to the date of her own disbarment, and then further back still. A cold, heavy anchor dropped in her stomach as the final, invisible piece of the architecture slotted into place. Her father. 10 years ago, her father's distinguished legal career had ended in a sudden, baffling disgrace, a catastrophic failure to protect a client from a labyrinthine takeover orchestrated by a younger, rising executive named Vincent Hale. It hadn't been a failure of competence. Her father had been the prototype. When Patricia had begun to show the same forensic brilliance, sniffing around the edges of Hale's perfected mechanism, Hale hadn't panicked. He had simply deployed the refined version of the same algorithm. They were not separate tragedies. They were sequential moves in a long, quiet war. Nexus Pacific's entire empire was built on a single, fundamental vulnerability, the absolute necessity that no one ever recognized the pattern. Every victim believed their failure was unique. Every target died in a silo. Patricia stood up slowly, the fluorescent light humming overhead. The paralyzing shame that had kept her in this uniform for 3 years vanished, replaced by the lethal clarity of a weapon finally understanding its own purpose. Hale's system relied on his victims never seeing the whole board, but Patricia was now the only person alive who had survived the mechanism from the inside and dismantled it from the outside. That dual perspective was not a vulnerability. It was the most dangerous thing she had ever been. The charcoal wool blazer she wore into the glass and steel atrium of Moon's corporate headquarters was the exact suit she had kept sealed in plastic for 3 years, waiting for a morning that required armor. High above the city, Myung-Ho Moon did not offer her a redemption arc, nor did he perform the role of a savior. Sitting across the expanse of a brushed aluminum desk, his proposition was delivered with the brutal economy of a wartime general enlisting an assassin. He was offering her the position of Chief Contracts Counsel. He did not need a standard lawyer, he needed a mutual weapon, an architect capable of building a legal fortress that Vincent Hale's ghost army could never penetrate, precisely because she knew exactly how they breached the walls. He slid a thick cream-colored dossier across the polished surface. It was her offer letter. Patricia did not reach for the pen. She pulled the document to the edge of the desk and began to read. She read it with the exact same lethal focus she had brought to the contract in the obsidian room. Every line, every clause, every nested sub-paragraph. The silence in the executive office deepened, measured only by the soft, rhythmic friction of turning pages. On page 9, her eyes stopped. There, buried deep within the architecture of Clause 11, residing quietly in sub-paragraph 3, she found it. It was a non-compete provision drafted with terrifying, deliberate ambiguity. It was a masterclass in structural vagueness, engineered so that, at Moon's sole discretion, the language could be weaponized to legally bar her from ever practicing commercial law independently again. It was a golden collar, polished to look like a standard corporate boundary. The woman who had been destroyed 3 years ago might have felt betrayed or panicked, or paralyzed by the realization that another trap had been set. The woman wearing the charcoal suit felt only cold, absolute clarity. Patricia did not speak. She did not raise her eyes to accuse the man sitting across from her. She simply reached forward, uncapped the heavy fountain pen resting on the blotter, and pressed the gold nib to the paper. With a single, uncompromising, and perfectly clean line of black ink, she crossed out the entirety of sub-paragraph 3. She initialed the margin, now capped the pen, and slid the contract back across the aluminum surface. Moon looked down at the amended page. What followed was the longest, heaviest silence of the entire ordeal, a breathless, terrifying void where the air in the room seemed to freeze entirely. Moon stared at the bold line striking through his carefully engineered trap. Slowly, he raised his head. The impenetrable mask of the underworld kingpin cracked, and for the first and only time, Myung-Ho Moon smiled. You passed. It had never been a trap. It was a deliberate test, a final confirmation that she had become someone who could never be ambushed by a hidden provision again. Without a word, Patricia took the pen back and signed her name on the bottom line. The sharp click of the metal cap echoing in the room was her final answer. Moon didn't speak. He simply reached to the edge of his desk, produced a heavy crystal decanter, and slid a glass of neat bourbon across the brushed aluminum. And a quiet initiation into her new life. 6 months later, the acoustics in the Seoul arbitration chamber had not changed. It was the exact same room where Patricia's career had been quietly and efficiently executed 3 years prior. The heavy oak paneling, the muted hum of the climate control, the vast expanse of the polished conference table. It was all designed to make the destruction of a life feel like administrative routine. She sat on the exact same side of the table, but the woman occupying the chair was unrecognizable. Across the expanse of wood sat Nexus Pacific's elite legal defense team. They wore the armor of the untouchable, immaculate navy suits, relaxed postures, the faint, practiced expressions of men accustomed to burying inconvenient truths under avalanches of procedural filings. They had arrived prepared to dismantle a standard breach of contract dispute on behalf of Vincent Hale. They did not know they were attending an autopsy. Representing Myung-Ho Moon's interests, Patricia did not open with a theatrical statement. She did not perform confidence or raise her voice to command the room. Instead, she reached into her leather briefcase and placed a single document precisely in the center of the table. It was Clause 17. The margins were heavily annotated in her own sharp black handwriting, dismantling the silent transfer provision line by line. Beside it, moving with unhurried, devastating rhythm, she laid down the rest. The 4 other collapsed contracts bearing the identical authorial fingerprint, the typewritten confession of a terrified 23-year-old paralegal, the offshore banking ledgers tracing back to Hale's discretionary fund, and finally, the digital forensics logs that proved the document tampering had originated from a Nexus Pacific server. The relaxed postures across the table subtly stiffened. The air in the chamber turned brittle. Patricia folded her hands on the table. They were perfectly, unnervingly steady. They were no longer the hands of someone who had merely survived a collapse. They were the hands of someone who had returned to the site of the rubble and finished what she started. In the absolute silence of the tribunal, Patricia began to speak. She did not use the dense, impenetrable legalese Hale's ghost army relied upon to hide their theft. She translated the architecture of the predator into plain, lethal reality. She read the language beneath the language out loud, stripping the camouflage from the weapon in a room where it could never be buried again. Every word dismantled a piece of Vincent Hale's empire. Outside the high-tinted glass of the chamber, Seoul moved through the bright, relentless momentum of its morning. The sun caught the edges of the skyline, indifferent to the corporate executions taking place behind closed doors. Patricia did not turn her head to look at the window. For 3 years, once she had survived by averting her eyes from the things that could destroy her. But as she laid the final piece of evidence on the table, she kept her gaze locked, dead ahead. There was nothing left to look away from.